The house had settled into that particular quiet that only comes after midnight, when even the refrigerator stops humming and the floorboards cease their gentle creaking. I sat in my study, surrounded by the detritus of adult responsibility. Utility bills stacked in neat piles, mortgage statements paper-clipped with mechanical precision, a reminder note about Naomi's college application deadlines written in Evelyn's careful handwriting. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light that barely reached the edges of the room, leaving the corners draped in shadows that seemed to pulse with the weight of accumulated years. My daughter's guitar leaned against the far wall, silent and waiting. She had left it there after practice earlier, the case propped open like a mouth caught mid-sentence. Above it, our wedding photograph sat on the shelf. Evelyn and I frozen in that moment of supposed beginning, her dress a cascade of white silk, my smile broad and certain in a way that now felt like looking at a stranger. But I was not looking at photographs or bills or anything else in that room. My world had narrowed to the space between my ears, where the headphones created a cocoon of sound that transported me somewhere else entirely. The vinyl spun on the turntable beside me, that familiar ritual of needle finding groove, the slight crackle before the music began. It was an album I had not played in months, maybe longer, but tonight something had drawn me to it like a moth to flame. The melody wrapped around me, each note a key turning in locks I had long ago sealed shut. It was music from another lifetime, from college years that felt both impossibly distant and achingly immediate. As the song built to its crescendo, I closed my eyes and let myself fall backward through time, past the mortgage payments and parent-teacher conferences, past the careful construction of the life I now inhabited. Suddenly, I was 20 again, sitting cross-legged on a narrow dorm room bed, these same headphones covering my ears. The memory arrived with such clarity it took my breath away. Laughter spilling from the hallway outside, the kind of careless joy that belongs only to people who have not yet learned to measure their happiness in small, careful doses. And then Rowan was there, appearing in my doorway without knocking, his dark hair falling across his forehead in that way that made my chest tighten. He had crossed the small room in 2 quick strides, his eyes bright with mischief, and something else I had been too afraid to name. Before I could protest or pull away, his hands were on my headphones, tugging them gently from my ears. The gesture was playful, demanding, intimate in a way that sent electricity down my spine. He wanted to be part of whatever private world I had created for myself. He refused to let me disappear into the music alone. The memory was so vivid I could smell the industrial detergent they used in the dormitory laundry, could feel the scratchy wool of the blanket beneath my legs. But it was Rowan's face that dominated everything else. The way he looked at me in that moment after removing the headphones, as if he could see straight through to something I kept hidden even from myself. I opened my eyes and was back in my study, 44 years old, and wearing a wedding ring that had long since worn a permanent indent in my finger. The song continued to play, but now it felt like an accusation. How had I let that boy disappear so completely? How had I convinced myself that the trembling I felt whenever Rowan looked at me was nothing more than friendship, nothing more than the natural intensity of youth? The weight of the present pressed down on me like a physical thing. Upstairs, Evelyn slept the deep sleep of someone whose days were full and purposeful. Down the hall, Naomi's room stood empty. She was spending the night at a friend's house, preparing for her final semester before college. This life I had built was solid, respectable, exactly what I had thought I wanted when I was young and terrified of the feelings that Rowan's presence stirred in me. But sitting there in the lamplight, with that music filling the space between my thoughts, I felt the careful architecture of my contentment beginning to crack. The melodies seemed to mock the neat stacks of bills, the family photograph, the guitar that belonged to a daughter who would soon leave to build her own life. It whispered of roads not taken, of conversations never finished, of a hand that had pulled away too quickly when it should have lingered. I reached for the turntable with trembling fingers, my hand hovering over the needle. The song had only minutes left to play, but I could not bear to hear it end. Instead, I lifted the needle with the delicate care one might use to defuse a bomb, watching as the record continued its silent revolution. The sudden quiet felt like a held breath. Carefully, as if the vinyl might shatter at rough handling, I slid the record back into its sleeve. But my hands betrayed me, shaking with an emotion I could not name or perhaps simply refuse to acknowledge. As I closed the album cover, I realized I was not just putting away a song. I was attempting to bury something that had no intention of staying buried, something that had been waiting patiently for 24 years for exactly this moment to resurface and demand to be heard. The morning arrived as it always did, with the mechanical precision of suburban routine. The coffee maker gurgled to life at exactly 6:15, programmed years ago to coincide with Evelyn's internal clock. I heard her footsteps above me, the familiar rhythm of someone who had long ago perfected the art of efficient mornings. By the time I made my way to the kitchen, she was already dressed for her job at the insurance office, her hair pulled back in that practical style she had worn for the past decade. Our house sat on Maple Street like 1,000 others in upstate New York, a modest colonial with blue shutters and a front porch that we had always meant to refinish but never quite found the time for. The neighborhood was the kind where people knew each other's names but respected the invisible boundaries of polite distance. Children rode bicycles on sidewalks that were swept clean, and lawn mowers hummed their weekend songs with religious regularity. Naomi emerged from the bathroom in a cloud of teenage urgency, her dark hair still damp from the shower. She moved through the kitchen with the restless energy of someone counting down the days until escape. Senior year had transformed her into a creature of college applications and future plans. Each conversation weighted with the unspoken knowledge that our family unit was approaching its natural expiration date. "Good morning, sweetheart," Evelyn said, sliding a plate of toast across the counter. "Did you finish the essay for Syracuse?" "Almost," Naomi replied, grabbing an apple from the bowl by the window. "I just need to tweak the conclusion." I watched this exchange from my position by the coffee maker, feeling like an observer in my own life. This was the choreography we had perfected over 18 years. Evelyn managing the logistics of our existence, Naomi preparing for her launch into adulthood, and me providing a steady, reliable presence that anchored them both. It was a role I had learned to play so well that sometimes I forgot it was a performance. The drive to the high school where I taught English took me through neighborhoods that told the story of a town caught between its industrial past and its uncertain future. Empty storefronts alternated with coffee shops and yoga studios, the old giving way to the new with the slow inevitability of generational change. I had been making this same drive for 16 years, watching the seasons cycle through the windshield, marking time in the familiar landmarks that punctuated my route. My classroom occupied a corner of the building's second floor, its windows facing east toward the morning sun. The walls were lined with bookcases that sagged under the weight of worn paperbacks and hardcover editions donated by parents cleaning out their attics. Posters of literary figures gazed down at rows of desks where teenagers slouched with the particular posture of those who had not yet learned to hide their boredom behind adult politeness. I had chosen teaching because literature felt like a safe way to explore the depths of human experience without having to live them myself. Through the pages of novels and collections of poetry, I could examine passion and loss and the terrible beauty of authentic feeling while maintaining the careful distance of academic analysis. My students respected me for my patience and my ability to make dusty classics feel relevant to their lives, but they could not have known that every discussion of unrequited love or societal expectations felt like examining my own reflection in a funhouse mirror. During lunch, I often retreated to my classroom rather than joining my colleagues in the faculty lounge. I would sit at my desk, grading papers or preparing lessons, but sometimes I would simply stare out the window at the parking lot where cars sat in neat rows like a diagram of suburban contentment. My colleagues were good people who spoke of their families and weekend plans with genuine enthusiasm, but I had learned over the years to smile and nod while feeling like an anthropologist studying a culture I could observe but never truly inhabit. The afternoons brought me home to a house that smelled of dinner preparation and the particular energy that Naomi generated when she was stressed about her future. Evelyn would greet me with updates about her day, details about clients and office politics that I absorbed with the practiced attention of someone who had learned that marriage required active participation in the mundane mechanics of shared existence. We would eat dinner together, the three of us around the kitchen table, maintaining the rituals that had once felt natural but now required conscious effort to sustain. In the living room, photographs documented the life we had built together, vacation snapshots from visits to national parks, birthday parties captured in the golden light of summer afternoons, anniversary dinners where we smiled for the camera with the determination of people committed to creating evidence of their happiness. Evelyn looked beautiful in every image, her face open and trusting in a way that made my chest tighten with guilt. I appeared beside her looking appropriately proud and content, the very picture of a man who had successfully constructed the American dream. But it was in the evenings, after the dishes were washed and homework was completed and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, that I retreated to my study and felt the mask slip away. The room had become my sanctuary, the one place where I could drop the careful performance of contentment and simply exist in the space between who I was supposed to be and who I actually was. The record player sat waiting in the corner, a portal to memories I had spent decades trying to forget. Sometimes Evelyn would find me there, lost in thought or staring at nothing in particular. She would ask if I was feeling all right, her voice carrying the particular concern of someone who sensed something wrong but could not name it. I would reassure her that I was simply tired, that the stress of the school year was weighing on me, and she would accept these explanations because the alternative, that her husband was a stranger to himself, was too complicated to consider. The truth was that I had become expert at living a half-life, at pouring my energy into the roles that others expected me to play, while keeping the essential parts of myself locked away where they could not cause damage. I was a good teacher, a dependable husband, a present father, but beneath all of these identities lay a hollow space that grew larger with each passing year. I told myself that this was simply the natural process of growing up, of accepting that adult life required sacrifices and compromises that youth could not understand. But on nights when the house was quiet and the weight of unspoken truths pressed against my chest like a physical thing, I knew that I was lying to myself as much as I was lying to everyone else. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, mixed in with the usual collection of utility bills and grocery store circulars that filled our mailbox. I almost missed it entirely, the glossy cardstock sliding between the pages of a catalog for garden supplies that Evelyn had ordered but never read. It was only when I was sorting the mail at the kitchen counter that the elegant typography caught my eye. An invitation to the 25th reunion of the Harmonic Society, my old university music club. The card felt heavier than it should have in my hands, its weight seeming to increase as I read the details. Save the date. Join us for an evening of music and memories. The same hall where we had spent countless hours listening to vinyl records and debating the merits of obscure artists whose names I had not spoken aloud in decades. The same place where I had met Rowan. I set the invitation aside, telling myself it was impossible to attend. The reunion fell on a weekend when Naomi had college visits planned, and Evelyn had already scheduled the dinner with her sister. There were a dozen practical reasons why I could not go, and I recited them to myself like a protective incantation against the pull I felt toward that glossy card. But the invitation would not be ignored. It sat on my desk in the study, catching the lamplight each evening like an accusation waiting to be answered. During my classes, I found myself losing track of discussions about character motivation and thematic significance, my mind drifting instead to memories of late-night sessions in the music room where time seemed to move differently and every song felt like a revelation. 3 days after the invitation arrived, I found myself standing in front of the bedroom closet at 2 in the morning, staring at a cardboard box that I had not opened in years. It sat on the top shelf, pushed back behind winter coats and forgotten Christmas decorations, labeled in my younger self's handwriting simply as college. My hands trembled as I pulled it down, the weight of it surprising me with its lightness. as if the years had somehow drained substance from the memories it contained. The photographs spilled across my desk like fragments of another life. There was the music room with its mismatched furniture and walls covered in concert posters. There was the group of us gathered around the record player, our faces bright with the particular intensity that comes from discovering art that speaks directly to your soul. And there, in image after image, was Rowan, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his eyes bright with laughter, his arms slung casually over my shoulder in a way that had once felt natural but now seemed charged with unspoken significance. In one photograph, Rowan's head was thrown back in laughter at something I had apparently just said, his mouth open in joy, his hand resting on my knee in a gesture so intimate that I felt my breath catch in my throat. I remembered the moment. We had been listening to a recording of Coltrane, and I had made some pretentious observation about the spiritual nature of improvisation. Rowan had laughed, not at me, but with delight at my earnestness, and in that moment I had felt more seen and understood than I had ever felt before or since. I studied each photograph with the desperate attention of an archaeologist trying to reconstruct a lost civilization from scattered artifacts. Here was evidence of a version of myself that I had carefully erased, a young man who laughed freely, who spoke passionately about music and literature, who allowed himself to be photographed with his arm around another boy, as if such intimacy were the most natural thing in the world. The discovery of these images left me hollow and restless in a way that I could not explain to Evelyn when she asked why I seemed distracted. I moved through the following days like a man underwater, everything muffled and distant except for the sharp clarity of those memories that the photographs had awakened. I found myself taking longer routes to work, driving past places that reminded me of those college years when the world had felt infinite with possibility. It was on one of these meandering drives that I saw him. I was stopped at a traffic light downtown, watching pedestrians cross the street with the idle attention of someone killing time, when a familiar figure caught my eye. Older, certainly, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of 24 years of living, but unmistakably Rowan. He walked with the same easy grace I remembered, his hands in his pockets, his attention focused on something beyond the immediate sidewalk. Without thinking, I pulled into a parking space and followed him, my heart pounding with a mixture of panic and anticipation that made me feel like a teenager again. He was walking toward the small coffee shop that had opened where the old bookstore used to be, and I found myself standing outside its windows, watching him order at the counter, wondering if I had the courage to go inside. The decision was taken from me when he turned and our eyes met through the glass. For a moment, we simply stared at each other across 24 years of silence, and then he was smiling, that same crooked grin that had once made my stomach flip, and gesturing for me to come inside. "Julian," he said, as if no time had passed at all, still hiding behind those headphones. The question hit me like a physical blow, carrying with it all the weight of our shared history and the life I had built in the absence of his presence. He looked older, certainly, but there was something unchanged in his eyes, a spark of mischief and intelligence that time had not dimmed. We embraced awkwardly, the kind of careful hug that men of our age and background had learned to navigate, but even that brief contact sent electricity through my body. "I am back temporarily," he explained, settling into the chair across from me with 2 cups of coffee between us. "My father is not well. Cancer. I moved back last month to help him through treatment." The conversation that followed was careful and charged, each of us testing the waters of a friendship that had ended abruptly when I graduated a year before him and disappeared into the safe anonymity of graduate school and eventual marriage. He told me about his life. Years spent teaching music in different cities, relationships that had come and gone, a certain restlessness that had kept him moving until his father's illness brought him home. "And you?" he asked, stirring sugar into his coffee with the same deliberate attention I remembered from our youth. "Are you happy, Julian?" The question hung between us like something alive and dangerous. I told him about my teaching, about Evelyn and Naomi, about the house on Maple Street with its blue shutters and unfinished front porch. I spoke of my life as if it belonged to someone else, describing the careful construction of contentment that I had spent decades perfecting. But Rowan listened with the same intensity he had once brought to our late-night conversations about music and meaning, and I could see in his eyes that he heard not just what I was saying, but what I was not saying. When I finished my careful recitation of accomplishments and milestones, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You always were good at hiding in plain sight," he said, and something in his voice made it clear that our reunion was not a coincidence, but an inevitability that had been waiting 24 years to occur. What began as a single cup of coffee stretched into afternoon walks through the park, where we had once spent hours debating the merits of Dylan versus Cohen. Rowan's presence in my life felt both completely natural and utterly dangerous, like returning to a language I had forced myself to forget. We met twice that first week, then 3 times the following week, always with the careful justification that we were simply old friends catching up after decades of separation. He lived in a small apartment above the antique shop on Main Street, a space that felt like a museum of a life lived without compromise. Record albums lined the walls in neat rows, their spines creating a colorful timeline of musical evolution from his college years to the present. Books were stacked on every available surface, volumes of poetry, musical theory, biographies of artists whose names I had not thought about in years. It was the home of someone who had chosen beauty and solitude over security and convention. We would sit on his threadbare couch, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of his wandering years, and listen to music with the same intensity we had brought to those late-night sessions in the university music room. He would pull an album from his collection and place it on the turntable with the reverence of someone performing a sacred ritual, and I would find myself transported back to that younger version of myself who believed that the right song could unlock the mysteries of existence. "You still listen like you were trying to memorize every note," he said one afternoon, watching me as Joni Mitchell's voice filled the small room. "It was always one of my favorite things about you." The compliment hit me like a physical touch, warming something inside my chest that I had not realized had gone cold. In my real life, the life of mortgages and parent-teacher conferences and careful suburban routines, no one noticed how I listened to anything. Evelyn tolerated my music, but did not share my passion for it, and Naomi had long ago dismissed her father's taste as hopelessly outdated. But Rowan saw me, really saw me, in a way that made me feel substantial and interesting and alive. He began lending me records, pressing albums into my hands as I prepared to leave his apartment each evening. "Take this one," he would say, his fingers brushing mine as he handed me a vintage pressing of something I had forgotten I loved. "Listen to track 4. Really listen. I think you will understand what he is trying to say about longing." I would drive home with these musical contraband hidden in my car, feeling like a teenager sneaking cigarettes past disapproving parents. At home, I would wait until the house was quiet before retreating to my study and placing Rowan's selections on my own turntable. Each song felt like a message written in the secret language we had once shared, and I found myself hearing layers of meaning that had been invisible to me for decades. The music awakened something in me that I had buried so completely I had forgotten it existed. I began writing again, not the careful lesson plans and academic papers that filled my professional life, but fragments of poetry that spilled out of me during lunch breaks and quiet moments between classes. The words felt rusty and uncertain, like muscles that had not been used in years, but they came nonetheless, demanding to be written down on scraps of paper that I hid in my desk drawer like evidence of a crime. Rowan had never married, a fact that he mentioned casually during one of our walks, but which lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. He spoke of relationships that had come and gone, of lovers who had grown tired of his restlessness or his inability to commit to anything beyond the next city, the next teaching position, the next adventure. There was a loneliness in his stories that I recognized, though his solitude seemed chosen while mine felt imposed by circumstances beyond my control. He told me about teaching music to children in rural schools, about summer festivals where he had played backup guitar for singers whose names I vaguely recognized, about winters spent in cabin rentals where he had written songs that no one would ever hear. His life sounded bohemian and romantic in a way that made my own existence feel small and constrained, but I could hear beneath his stories the cost of such freedom, the absence of roots, the lack of witnesses to his daily existence, the particular sadness that comes from never staying anywhere long enough to be truly known. As October deepened into November, I found myself thinking about Rowan during faculty meetings and dinner conversations with my family. His presence in my life created a split-screen effect. I would be discussing Naomi's college applications with Evelyn while simultaneously remembering something funny Rowan had said about his students, or I would be teaching my afternoon classes while anticipating our evening walk through neighborhoods that felt transformed by his company. Evelyn noticed the change, though she could not name what was different. "You seem lighter lately," she said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "More like yourself." The observation stung because it was both accurate and impossible to explain. I was becoming more like myself, but it was a version of myself that predated our marriage, a person I had been before I learned to edit my enthusiasms and moderate my passions for the sake of fitting into the life I had chosen. Naomi, with the particular perception that teenagers possess for detecting parental hypocrisy, sensed my distraction even when I was physically present. She would ask me questions about her college essays or her plans for senior year, and I would realize I had been nodding along to her words without actually hearing them. My mind was elsewhere, replaying conversations with Rowan or anticipating our next meeting. The guilt of this emotional absence should have been enough to make me pull back, to establish boundaries that would protect the life I had built with such careful intention. But the hours I spent with Rowan felt like breathing after years of holding my breath, and I found I could not give them up despite the growing awareness that I was living a double life. It was on a cold evening in late November that everything shifted. I had been at Rowan's apartment for several hours, listening to an album I had not heard since college while he prepared dinner in his small kitchen. The domesticity of the scene, the smell of garlic and herbs, the warm light from his mismatched lamps, the easy silence between us, felt more natural than anything in my actual home. I was wearing his headphones, lost in a song that had once meant everything to me, when I felt his presence beside the couch. Before I could react, his hands were on the headphones, gently pulling them from my ears in the exact gesture he had used 24 years earlier in his dorm room. The parallel was so perfect, so deliberate, that it took my breath away. But this time, instead of placing the headphones over his own ears, he set them aside and looked at me with an expression that contained 24 years of unspoken questions. The music continued to play from the speakers, but it seemed distant and unimportant compared to the electricity in the air between us. "I always wondered," he said quietly, "what would have happened if I had been braver back then." His words hung in the space between us like something alive and dangerous, and I felt the careful architecture of my adult life beginning to crack under the weight of what we were not saying. The trembling that started in my hands spread through my entire body, and I realized that I was no longer remembering desire but experiencing it, raw and immediate and impossible to deny. The silence that followed Rowan's words stretched between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross. The record continued to spin on the turntable, the needle tracing its circular path through grooves that held memories older than the distance we had traveled to find ourselves here again. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, loud enough to drown out the music that had brought us together all those years ago. Rowan moved away from the couch, but not far, just enough to give me space to breathe, to think, to flee if that was what I chose to do. Instead, I found myself studying his face in the lamplight, cataloging the changes that 24 years had written there. The lines around his eyes spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure, and there was a patience in his expression that suggested he had learned to wait for things that might never come. "Do you remember that night in April?" he said, settling into the chair across from me. "Senior year, yours not mine. We had been listening to Carole King until 3 in the morning, and you fell asleep on my bed." I remembered. God help me. I remembered everything about that night. The way the moonlight had fallen across his narrow dorm room, the weight of his blanket over both of us, the careful distance I had maintained even in sleep. I had woken before dawn and slipped away like a thief, unable to face whatever conversation the morning might demand. "You were so careful never to touch me," he continued, his voice soft but steady. "Even when we were drunk, even when everyone else was crashing into each other like pinballs. You would sit close enough that I could feel the heat from your body, but you never let our hands brush accidentally. I thought it meant you knew." "Knew what?" I managed to say, though the words felt thick and strange in my mouth. "That I was in love with you." The admission hung in the air between us like something that could not be taken back. I felt the careful walls I had built around that part of my memory beginning to crumble, revealing truths I had spent decades learning to ignore. All those nights we had spent together, all those conversations that had felt charged with unspoken meaning, they had not been products of my imagination or wishful thinking. They had been real. "I thought you knew," Rowan repeated, leaning forward in his chair. "The way you looked at me sometimes, the way you would get quiet when I mentioned dating someone else." I was 20 years old and convinced that love was obvious, that it announced itself in gestures and glances that couldn't be misunderstood. I closed my eyes and let myself remember that younger version of myself, the boy who had felt his stomach drop every time Rowan smiled at someone else, who had memorized the sound of his laugh and the way he moved through rooms as if they belonged to him. I had been so afraid of what those feelings meant, so terrified of being discovered, that I had convinced myself they were nothing more than intense friendship. "I was scared," I said finally, the words barely above a whisper. I was 21 years old and scared of everything, of wanting something I couldn't name, of being something I didn't understand. So I buried it. But it didn't stay buried, did it? No, it didn't. Rowan stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below where cars passed under the amber glow of streetlights. His apartment felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were contracting around the weight of what we were finally saying to each other. "I waited for you to call," he said without turning around. "After graduation, after you moved away for graduate school. I thought maybe once you had some distance, some time to think, you might reach out. But you never did." The accusation in his voice was gentle but unmistakable, and I felt the full weight of all the letters I had never written, all the phone calls I had never made. I had disappeared completely, cutting him out of my life with the surgical precision of someone removing a malignant growth. "I got married," I said, as if that explained everything. I convinced myself that was what I wanted, what I was supposed to want. "Evelyn is a good woman. She deserves better than half a life with someone who was pretending to be someone else. And are you still pretending?" The question cut through me like a blade. I opened my eyes and looked at him standing by the window, his reflection ghosted in the glass like a double exposure of past and present. How could I answer that question honestly? How could I admit that every day of my marriage had been a performance, that I had become so skilled at playing the role of contentment that I had almost convinced myself it was real? Rowan turned away from the window and walked back to where I sat on the couch. This time he did not maintain the careful distance that had once characterized our friendship. He sat beside me, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne, close enough that when he reached out to touch my hand, I could not pretend it was accidental. "Julian," he said, and my name in his voice sounded like a prayer or a confession. "I need you to know that I'm not asking you to destroy your life. I'm not asking you to leave your family or abandon everything you've built. But I am asking you to stop pretending that this thing between us doesn't exist." His hand covered mine, warm and familiar despite the decades that had passed since we had last touched with intention. I stared down at our joined hands, my wedding ring catching the lamplight, his fingers bare and ink stained from the letters he wrote to friends scattered across the country. I should have pulled away. I should have stood up and walked out of that apartment and driven home to my wife and daughter and the life I had chosen with such deliberate care. Instead, I turned my hand over so that our palms pressed together and felt something inside my chest crack open like an egg. When Rowan leaned closer, I did not move away. When his other hand came up to touch my face, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to feel the warmth of his palm against my cheek. And when he kissed me, softly at first, Then, with the desperate hunger of 24 years of waiting, I kissed him back with everything I had been holding inside since I was 21 years old and too afraid to reach for what I wanted. The kiss lasted only moments, but it felt like falling through time, past all the careful constructions of my adult life, and into the truth I had been running from since college. When we broke apart, I was trembling with the force of what I had just acknowledged, not just to him, but to myself. "I have to go," I said, standing up so quickly that the room seemed to tilt around me. "I have to go home." Rowan did not try to stop me, but he watched me gather my jacket with eyes that held no judgment, only a profound sadness that made my chest ache. "I know," he said quietly, "but now you know too." The drive home passed in a blur of streetlights and stop signs that I navigated on autopilot. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the house where my family slept peacefully, unaware that their husband and father had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Inside, I moved through the darkened rooms like a ghost haunting his own life. The photographs on the mantel seemed to mock me with their evidence of happiness, and I found myself studying Evelyn's face in our wedding picture, wondering how I had convinced myself that the smile I wore that day was genuine. When I finally climbed the stairs to our bedroom, Evelyn stirred but did not wake. I lay beside her in the dark, listening to her breathe, and realized with devastating clarity how much of myself I had withheld from this woman who had loved me for 20 years. She had married a man who existed only partially, who had given her his loyalty and his presence, but never his whole heart. The taste of Rowan's kiss lingered on my lips like evidence of a crime, and I knew that everything had changed irrevocably. There would be no returning to the careful ignorance that had sustained my marriage, no pretending that the hollow ache in my chest was simply the natural result of middle age. I had been living a half-life for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be completely awake, and now that I remembered, I did not know how I would bear the weight of what I had lost. The days that followed moved with the strange quality of a dream, where everything appears normal on the surface, while something fundamental has shifted beneath. I continued teaching my classes, continued coming home for dinner, continued participating in the careful choreography of family life, but I felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines and was improvising his way through scenes he no longer understood. Rowan did not call, did not appear at my workplace, or knock on my door in the middle of the night demanding answers I was not ready to give. His absence felt deliberate, generous even, a gift of space and time to process what had happened between us. But the silence also felt like a question hanging in the air, waiting for me to decide whether that kiss had been an ending or a beginning. I found myself driving past his apartment on my way home from work, slowing down to see if his windows were lit, wondering what he was doing in the hours we were not together. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of his silhouette moving behind the curtains, and the sight would send a jolt of longing through me so sharp that I would have to pull over and wait for my hands to stop shaking before I could continue driving. At home, I moved through our evening routines with the mechanical precision of someone following a script. I helped Naomi with her college applications, listened to Evelyn's stories from her day at the insurance office, watched television programs whose plots I could not follow because my mind was elsewhere. But I could feel Evelyn watching me with the particular attention of someone who sensed that something had changed but could not name what it was. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in early December. Snow had begun to fall during dinner, the first real snow of the season, and Naomi had gone upstairs to work on her final essay for Northwestern. Evelyn and I were cleaning up in the kitchen when she set down the dish she was drying and turned to face me with an expression I had never seen before. "Julian," she said, her voice careful and controlled, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I felt my chest tighten with panic, wondering if she had somehow discovered my meetings with Rowan, if there were traces of betrayal written on my face that I had failed to scrub away. But when she spoke again, her words cut even deeper than accusation. "I don't know where you go when you're not here anymore." The observation hit me like a physical blow because it was both accurate and impossible to explain. I had been absent from my own life for weeks, maybe months, certainly since Rowan had returned, and forced me to confront the parts of myself I had buried. But how could I tell my wife that I had been living as a ghost in our marriage, that the man she had loved for 20 years was only a partial version of who I actually was? "What do you mean?" I said, though I knew exactly what she meant. Evelyn leaned against the counter, her arms crossed over her chest in a gesture that seemed more protective than defensive. "You used to be here," she said. "Really here. When we talked about Naomi's future or made plans for the weekend or just sat together watching television. But lately it's like you're performing the part of my husband rather than being him." Her words hung in the air between us like an indictment that I could not refute because it was completely true. I had been performing, had been going through the motions of marriage while keeping the essential parts of myself locked away where they could not cause damage. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it with a depth that surprised me. "I don't know how to explain what's been happening." "Try," she said simply. So I did. Not everything. I could not bring myself to tell her about Rowan, about the kiss that had shattered 20 years of careful denial. But I told her about feeling hollow, about realizing that I had denied myself something essential without even understanding what it was. I spoke about the sense that I had been sleepwalking through my own existence, making choices based on what I thought I should want rather than what I actually wanted. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her face cycling through expressions I could not read. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring out the kitchen window at the snow that continued to fall in the yellow glow of the streetlights. "I've known for a long time that there was something you weren't telling me," she said finally. "Something you maybe weren't even telling yourself. I always hoped that eventually you would trust me enough to share it, whatever it was." The sadness in her voice was worse than anger would have been, worse than accusations or demands for explanations I could not give. She had known, had perhaps always known, that she was married to a man who was keeping secrets from himself as much as from her. "What happens now?" I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to hear the answer. "I don't know," she said. "That depends on what you decide you want your life to look like." 3 weeks later, Naomi left for her early admission program at Northwestern. We drove her to the campus together, the three of us squeezed into the front seat of our sedan like we used to do when she was small. But the easy familiarity of family road trips felt forced now, shadowed by the unspoken knowledge that this journey marked the end of something that could not be recovered. Watching Naomi carry her boxes into the dormitory, I felt the peculiar grief that comes from realizing that a chapter of your life has ended while you were too distracted to pay proper attention to its closing pages. She hugged us both goodbye with the confident enthusiasm of someone launching herself into an uncertain but exciting future, and I envied her certainty, her ability to move forward without looking back. The drive home was quiet. Evelyn sat beside me staring out the passenger window, and I knew we were both thinking about the house we were returning to, how different it would feel without Naomi's presence filling the spaces between our careful conversations. For 18 years, our daughter had been the bridge between us, the shared project that gave our marriage purpose and direction. Now we would have to figure out how to be together without the buffer of parental responsibility. That night, I sat in my study longer than usual, not listening to music, but simply thinking about the choice that lay before me. I could continue the life I had built, could find my way back to the careful contentment that had sustained me for 2 decades. Evelyn would forgive my recent distance, would chalk it up to midlife restlessness and the natural adjustment that comes when children leave home. We could grow old together in our house on Maple Street, 2 people who cared for each other deeply but had never been completely honest about who they were. Or I could choose the truth, even if that truth destroyed everything I had worked so hard to construct. I could acknowledge that the kiss with Rowan had awakened something in me that would not go back to sleep, that I had spent 20 years trying to be someone I was not because I was too afraid to face who I actually was. The choice felt impossible because both options required a kind of betrayal, either of the woman who had loved me faithfully for 20 years, or of the parts of myself I had finally found the courage to acknowledge. There was no path forward that did not involve loss, no decision that would not leave someone wounded. But as I sat there in the quiet of my study, surrounded by the evidence of the life I had so carefully constructed, I realized that the choice had already been made the moment Rowan's lips touched mine. I could not unknow what I now knew about myself, could not unfeel what I had felt in his arms. The question was not whether I would choose honesty over safety, but whether I would have the courage to act on the choice that had already been made for me. The decision, when it finally came, arrived not with drama or declarations, but in the quiet space of an ordinary Tuesday morning. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold, watching the winter light filter through windows that needed cleaning. My wedding ring lay beside the cup, a circle of gold that had worn a permanent indentation in my finger over 20 years of wearing. Evelyn moved through the kitchen behind me with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate around silence. She did not ask why the ring was no longer on my hand, did not demand explanations or promises or timelines for decisions that felt too large for words. Instead, she poured herself coffee and sat across from me, and we shared a quiet that felt both final and strangely forgiving. "We have been good to each other," she said eventually, her voice soft but steady. "That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," I replied, and meant it with a completeness that surprised me. We did not speak of lawyers or division of assets or the practical mechanics of unmaking a life that had taken decades to construct. There would be time for those conversations later, when the immediate weight of this moment had settled into something more manageable. For now, it was enough to sit together in the kitchen where we had shared thousands of meals and acknowledge that some endings can be gentle even when they are devastating. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing outside Rowan's apartment building, my hands shaking with cold and anticipation. I had not called ahead, had not planned what I would say when he opened the door. But when he appeared in the doorway, his face cycling through surprise and hope and something that might have been relief, no words seemed necessary. He stepped aside to let me enter, and I walked into the familiar warmth of his small space with its walls lined with records and books, and the accumulated evidence of a life lived without compromise. Nothing had changed since my last visit, but everything felt different now that I was here, not as a married man stealing moments of connection, but as someone who had finally chosen honesty over safety. We did not rush toward explanations or promises about an uncertain future. Instead, we sat together on the worn rug in front of his record player, the same position we had occupied decades earlier when we were young and thought we had unlimited time to figure out what we meant to each other. Rowan selected an album from his collection with the same deliberate care I remembered from our college years, placing it on the turntable with the reverence of someone performing a sacred ritual. As the first notes filled the room, he picked up his headphones and held them toward me with a slight smile that contained 24 years of waiting. I took the headphones and settled them over my ears, closing my eyes as the music created that familiar cocoon of sound that had always been our private language. For several minutes, I lost myself in the melody, feeling the weight of the past months, the lies I had told myself, the choices I had avoided, the life I had constructed around the careful avoidance of truth, finally beginning to lift. When I felt Rowan's hands on the headphones, gently pulling them away in the exact gesture that had started everything, I did not resist. The music continued to play from the speakers, filling the space between us with sound that belonged to both of us now. For the first time in decades, I was not hiding behind the barrier of private listening, but sharing the experience completely, holding nothing back. I opened my eyes and found Rowan watching me with an expression that mixed joy and sorrow in equal measure. He understood, as he had always understood, that my presence here meant not just the beginning of something new, but the ending of something else that had once mattered deeply. We were not young anymore, not the boys who had fumbled toward each other in dormitory rooms with their whole lives spread out before them like blank pages. But we were here, finally and completely here, and that felt like enough. The future remained uncertain, filled with conversations we had not yet had and challenges we could not yet imagine. There would be difficulties with Naomi, complicated negotiations with Evelyn, the judgment of neighbors and colleagues who had known me only as half of a married couple. None of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was the way the afternoon light fell across Rowan's face, the way his hand felt when it covered mine, The way the music surrounded us like a blessing on this choice that had taken me a lifetime to make. For the first time in 24 years, I allowed myself to simply listen, not to escape from my life, but to finally, completely inhabit it.